Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Empowering the Next Generation of Women Leaders. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'm going to walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access that recording. And if at any time you have trouble with the audio or the video, please try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We are here to help. With that, I am pleased to welcome our esteemed panel for today. Dr. Tanuja Damani is a general surgeon at NYU Langone Health and serves as the surgical director and director of robotic surgical education at the NYU Langone Center of Esophageal Health. She also serves as the associate professor of surgery at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Kate Henderson serves as president of regional hospitals and strategic community partnerships at Ascension. Mary Beth Antone serves as the associate vice president of operations at Silver Cross Hospital in New Lenox, Illinois. And Dr. Monica Reed is an Intuitive board member, former Advent Health chief medical officer, and senior vice president and CEO of Advent Health Celebration in Orlando, Florida. Finally, Darla Hutton serves as the Vice President of Marketing and Customer Analytics at Intuitive. She is also a WISE Executive Sponsor and Inclusion Council Executive Committee member. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Darla for a brief welcome before we dive into our discussion today.
Thank you, Molly, for your role today, and also for Becker's partnering with Intuitive on this type of inclusion and diversity executive education content. I am thrilled about the focus of this leadership event today being about empowering our future female leaders in healthcare. I was recently reading an article by McKinsey and the leanin.org organization, and it was summarizing the largest benchmark study of women in corporate America. And the findings of that study showed that healthcare continues to outperform other industries in female representation at every level of talent. For example, in 2020, women accounted for 66% of all the entry-level healthcare employees out there. And that compares to 49% in all the other US industries. And though that percent declines as you start to move up into more senior roles, landing at about 30% in the C-suite, healthcare does continue to outperform all the other industries in female representation. And so this progress for our industry is really encouraging, but I don't believe that any of us on the line today would agree that the barriers to job satisfaction have been dismantled, or the obstacles to female advancement have been removed, or even that we know how to meet the critical challenges that women are now navigating with COVID-19. Hearing lessons learned and being able to apply the collective insights from the leaders like we have on the call today is very powerful. Our guests today, for me then, really represent this important pipeline of talent across our industry that we should be learning from. If you think about it, we have a surgeon who's now gone on to lead a surgical department. We have an RN who's ascended to be a hospital VP of operations, a department director that has served as a hospital VP, a COO, and now a regional president, and one woman who's done it all, who's been a surgeon, a chief medical officer, a hospital CEO, and now a med tech executive board member. Again, I am really looking forward to participating just like all of you today, and I know that I'm going to take tons of notes from these industry game changers that I'll be able to apply to my own development. So Molly, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I will come back for the recap and the close.
Thank you so much, Darla. To kick things off, panelists, I thought since our attendees now know you by title and name, we could get to know you a little bit better as leaders by talking about how you personally grew or changed or evolved this past year as a leader. I'm sure there's a lot there, but if you could perhaps pinpoint one way that you would highlight, I'm curious to learn what that is. Dr. Reed, can I turn to you first for your remarks?
Sure thing. When I think about how I've grown this year, the first word that comes to mind is unevenly. It's been a really tough year. I think the year that we thought would end and we would see new beginnings has really kind of flipped itself on its head for us. And so I'm, a whole person like everyone else. And so I think understanding how to deal with change, and it is all an ongoing growth process, right? And so it's been that for me. And I would say one of the greatest areas of development for me, as a consultant, as a board member, working with other people, is being able to have the courage to say, I don't know, or that I can't fix it. I don't have a solution, which in a way can be exciting because it opens up space, if you will, for others to kind of put their heads together. But I think from a leadership standpoint, the vulnerability of being able to say, I don't know, and realizing that I'm going to have some uneven growth during this period, if not always, but certainly it's expounded upon this period, has really probably been very essential and the definition of what this year has been for me.
Mhm.
I see lots of heads nodding, uneven. I think that's a great term to describe what so many of us have experienced. Kate, let's turn to you next. How have you grown or evolved this past year?
Yeah, thanks for the great question, Molly. So I always thought that I did a pretty good job with self-care. And this last year taught me even more about practicing what I preach and really evaluating what I suggest for others and how I'm living out in my own life. And so I've learned to be a little bit more kinder and gentler with myself. And I think that's allowed me to be kinder and gentler and more understanding and empathetic also of others. I too am a whole person and still am pretty accustomed to driving hard, but recognizing in these circumstances that the best thing I could do for me as a person and as a leader in being able to take care of myself so I can take care of others and really give myself permission to do some more really intentional self-care, to when I say that I need some downtime, to really using downtime, not sort of cheat around the edges, which I've been known to do. And so it really helped me re-examine what that means to take care of myself and how really critically essential that has been to being able to show up and be there for others. So another chapter in that book. I think I just sort of learned that to a very different degree than I'd ever learned it before.
It's so important too, because early on this crisis, it brought so many opportunities for us to act on adrenaline and kind of that clear focus that only a crisis can bring. But when it's stretched over this duration of time, it really does bring so much need for self-care.
Mhm.
So thanks for bringing that up, Kate. Mary Beth, let's turn to you.
Sure. I agree with what my previous colleagues have said. I too have grown as a whole person unevenly, and I've learned about self-care. One of the things that I've always tried to do as a leader is to demonstrate a demeanor of control, because if there's not boxes around what we do and how we react, it makes our staff nervous. And I realized over the past year that I really had no control. The pandemic was controlling us, and it is how we as an organization, as a team, as leaders responded to the challenges from the pandemic. So I've grown more patient. I've grown more open to having plans that are fluid and not necessarily black and white, putting a little bit more gray into that bucket. And I've also grown as a leader that I always prided myself on the fact that I'm always a part of the team, but really was able to, by virtue of how our organization dealt with in the early stages of that pandemic and through the second wave, to learn much more about what else happens in this organization and to learn from other leaders about the contributions that their departments make to the overall purpose that we have here at Silver Cross is obviously to take care of patients. So I would say learning how to give up control, becoming a little more patient, and being kinder and gentler with myself as well.
So much has been already put forth, Dr. Damani. Is there anything you would add? Any other muscles that you have flexed throughout the past 18 months or so?
Yeah, it's interesting to listen from some of my colleagues, because I think I share obviously very similar emotions. But I think, as Mary Beth said, one of the things that really struck me, I was as the surgical director of my esophageal center, I was in my silo with my small team. And then once the pandemic hit New York City early on, I think there was just so much uncertainty for us. All elective surgery shut down, and it was kind of the all hands on deck approach. So I was volunteering in the COVID ICU, and that's where I think I really saw what happens when there's a shared sense of purpose by an organization. Even though there were so many unknowns early in the pandemic, there was this shared sense of purpose that we will get through this, we will do the best we can. We may not save everybody, but we will do the best. And I think what I saw, that sense just permeated through every level, from our transport people, nurses, techs, physicians, I mean, just all across. And it was just so wonderful to see, to just come out of my silo and see what happens when these times of crisis happen at organizations and how people come together. And I think, as some of my colleagues can attest to, seeing that human side of the C-suite people, that empathy, that humility. I don't have the answers. I'm wrong, or I may not know. And that transparency and communication, I think, was just wonderful and a great lesson in leadership.
So much has been said so far. We're only a few minutes in, but getting comfortable with saying, I don't know, the renewed importance for self-care, getting more comfortable with loss of control. And then Dr. Damani, like you said, shared sense of purpose, which is a scientific finding of how the best teams operate. To see that in an intense way in real time unfold in your organization has changed your leadership style or approach. So we have a lot to unpack today. I want to get started right away. In addition to the thoughts you just built upon, Dr. Damani, I'm going to stay with you for our first area of exploration, which is about unconscious bias. Familiar with unconscious bias? We read about it. It's been studied greatly. I'm curious to check in with you to see what's the state of the union with unconscious bias today. How do you see it unfolding still? If you had to share with attendees what to keep an eye out or what it looks like right now, from your viewpoint, I think they'd be curious to learn.
Yeah, no, I think, like you said, so much has been done in this field that we can't obviously do justice to this topic. But a little bit about, I think what we're talking about is really, for our audience, the implicit bias, that kind of unconscious attitude or belief, that rapid, instinctive, that happens in microseconds, where you form an opinion, a belief about, in this case, a gender. And I think this is, we all know, women are assigned these communal traits stereotypically, where they are acting to primarily meet the needs of others. You're nurturing, supportive, emotional, compared to the agentic traits that we assign to men, ambitious, authoritative, assertive. But what happens, especially in surgery, when these women leaders display these agentic traits, there's just a lot of incongruity. People cannot jive that with those stereotypical notions of a collegial or compassionate female, and that leads to a lot of negative perception about women, which honestly leads to just a lot more downstream, that negative view, where it'll lead to undervaluing women or decreasing their competence level in the minds, which then will affect, and we'll talk a little bit about this, their salaries, their status, promotions, leadership opportunities, clinical volume. I mean, it's well known that referring physicians, when they look at female surgeons, there are decreased referrals. Or if a female surgeon has a poor outcome, it's going to lead to a much lower ongoing referrals for that female surgeons and for others, because in their mind, they will use their experience or their interaction with one female and use it to update their beliefs about all females, which is something we don't see with male surgeons. So I think these are, in addition to our usual of how people view women, obviously the whole global social media campaign, #ILookLikeASurgeon, because there was this whole stereotypical image of what a surgeon should be like. And I think that campaign really celebrated female surgeons and kind of dismantled that stereotype. I mean, I see it in the operating rooms all the time, where if women are demanding or are a little loud, that's viewed very negatively versus there's a free pass for the male surgeon. So I think there's obviously a lot of implicit bias, especially in a male-dominated field like surgery. I think obviously our first step is to raise awareness about the implicit bias, but just raising awareness does not equal, behavioral change or behavioral action. And I think that's really where we have to work together to understand how, not just from a societal standard, but an organizational standard, how do we bring about this change? What are our tools to measure and then to enact that change? And I think we'll dive into a little bit about the pay inequities that this kind of implicit bias, which is key to that gender pay gap across really all specialties. But again, my knowledge is more about surgery, and I can share some of our stats and where we stand today on that.
Before we dive into the pay inequity part, I'm curious, like you said, raising awareness, it doesn't necessarily elicit behavioral change. But I think for our attendees with us today, we're talking about the next generation of leaders. Raising awareness can feel really uncomfortable sometimes. Do you have any insights as to how you effectively identify this? If you see it occurring in real time in your organization, how do you tap in some colleagues to affect change and to clue them in, like you said, because it's the first step to everything else that we're aiming to do here?
Yeah, and I think it's so important for us to, like you said, start talking about these uncomfortable things. Over the last year, we've had a bunch of my female colleagues give talks on things that are very uncomfortable, like the gender pay gap. And I think kind of discussing these in the mainstream becomes so important. But also, I think putting female leaders out there, giving them more opportunities, having them up on the podiums. The goal is to take away these stereotypical notions and images of what females can do or what they should look like, for our next generation to be able to really imagine their trajectory when they see these female surgeons or female leaders, to reconcile motherhood and career, and see that there are others who've done this. So I think, unfortunately, we don't have any great answers yet about what 1 or 2 step process would lead to effect that change. But I think, every step for us will lead towards that, both from organizational leadership to social media campaigns to society sponsorships and mentorships.
Well, let's talk about the pay gap, because I myself have been covering now the pay gap for years in medicine between male and female physicians. It's so strange to me how concerning it is, but yet every year it's treated as normal and to be expected. So Dr. Damani, for our attendees who, like we said, this next generation, how should they think about the pay gap? This is something that it's been really normalized, but I'm curious to check in with you how you make sense of it and what needs to be done about that.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, I see you shaking your head, and I shake my head when I think about how normalized it is, and how, as women physicians go up the ladder, this pay gap actually becomes more pronounced, where female chairs across the country make 21% less than their male counterparts. And that's just accepted. And I think that's what you said, where are we today, and what do we need to do? The rate at which we're going, I don't see gender pay equity happening, because the data says for US it would take 130 years at the trajectory that we're headed at to kind of resolve this kind of pay gap. So I mean, I think about it as really, what can one do, you who's in this situation, and then what can we do as leaders or societies? And I think one of the things we all agree with is that, a lot of women, this kind of implicit bias can wreak havoc on their self-confidence sometimes, because then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where they feel that they're not viewed as competent enough as their male colleagues, and that can kind of give them the whole imposter syndrome. So I think it's so important for us to mentor and sponsor our women, and to help them kind of eradicate this kind of self-doubt and to articulate their value to the institution when it comes to negotiating. We know that women are not as aggressive at seeking offers and counteroffers generally. they are not as sometimes effective during negotiations, to really giving them those tools to be able to navigate that. And I think the other thing is it's so important for women, you know, when you were saying, well, what can I do, to recognize that if you're in an underemployed situation, meaning for us, you know, if you're in a low volume, low case volume, low case complexity, where you are not getting the kinds of referral network that you want to get out of that underemployment situation, because that slows your career trajectory. And then again, as a department and organization, we should have more transparency about wages. What are our male counterparts getting for the same level, say associate professor? What are some of the metrics that we use to assess this compensation? RVU, which is in our world very commonly used, is not an effective metric. It does not measure efficiency, quality, does not measure team-based contributions. So we need to come up with better ways to really assess that. And then I think, like I said, organizationally, we need to give women those opportunities, those leadership roles. And at societies, we need to work. I mean, I have to commend American Association of Women Surgeons for the whole He for She committee. And I know some of my colleagues will talk about this a little later, about what men can do in surgery to empower women. What can they do in these male-dominated fields? So, as you know, I can just go on about this, but we have limited time. And I'm sure there's some valuable insights coming from the rest of the panel, Molly.
Let's check in with your co-panelists and see if there's anything they want to add to what you just shared.
I'd love to share. I think in addition to the great information you shared, there's this growing conversation about potential pay penalties that women who may have needed to step out of work, particularly during the last 18 months, to do their second job, which is oftentimes caregiving, that many of them may not be welcomed back into the workforce at the same level or in an advanced level of pay. And so when I think about that, you know, what are things that we all as female leaders in our organization, both in terms of the panel and those of you listening, can do, is to pay attention to how we are re-onboarding our female professionals into our workforce, and that we're making sure that we're giving credit for all of their experience and ensure that we're starting them off at the right rate of pay, and working on continuing to close that pay gap, because there's certainly a risk of us devaluing their years of experience because they needed to take some time off of work. I think there's also this bias that for individuals who may have needed to, many shift to remote work, and as some folks shift back, individuals who, often women who have a more flexible and remote work situation, will be sort of out of sight, out of mind, won't have the water cooler effect. We may not have yet done an adequate job establishing new, really cultural norms in our organizations regarding how we work together in these hybrid environments. And are we ensuring that everyone is at the table physically or virtually? Does everyone have a voice? Are we still investing in the same amount, or I would say in this case, more sponsorship of individuals who might be working remotely? So I think there's a opportunity right now more than ever to step into that space and really pay attention to that, as we have women in particular working in different kinds of environments with different flexible work schedules.
Definitely. I'm so glad you brought that up. The points about re-onboarding people who've had a temporary step aside to tend to other familial responsibilities or caregiving. And then also, like you said, what has this done to the promotion track, to the rubric of how women's performance, and men's too, is assessed, and what it means to be on your way to a promotion. That's a really great point, Kate. Anything else, Dr. Reed or Mary Beth, that you would want to add here before we move on?
Well, I'm so glad that you mentioned the re-onboarding of both men and women who have stepped off. You know, I think this whole work family truth that we work under, that men are unaffected, but women are affected, and we kind of assume that to be true. And studies show that we assign that type of thinking to women who may not even be married or have children. But this is what we believe about women, whereas what we know and what studies are increasingly showing is that both men and women are overworked. Both men and women require a different type of work to exist in today's society, but there's an assumption that the male can figure it out and that the woman has to go home. And until we kind of begin to break that societal norm, we're going to continue to struggle. And it's really a kind of a corporate culture of overwork and overproduction that we all suffer from. But we kind of think that, well, men are expected to do that, whereas women have shown over and over again that they can and do work hard and can be equally devoted to their families. Men the same way. It's just that how we view it as a society has kind of really done some damage to us in terms of how it affects all of us.
That's such a great point. And women, like you said, Dr. Reed, are expected to be ramping down, whereas men, when they either start families or step away, it's that they'll jump right back in and there's perhaps less space to show up. People don't necessarily see you as a father working.
Absolutely.
Well, for the sake of time, let's move on to our next area we're going to discuss, which is that of boundaries. Boundaries have become even more important than ever. So many natural separations between our work, family, parenting, socializing, they became very porous over the past year and some change. Kate, let's check in with you first on this idea, because the importance of boundaries, another thing that's been renewed in addition to the handful of concepts you shared in your opening remarks. What are you doing as a leader to set boundaries?
Thanks for the question. I think first I would say I'm still figuring it out. So I am by no means an expert in boundary setting, but really continue to learn and grow in this space. And it changes, you know, what that looks like and what feels comfortable and what I need and others around me need continues to evolve. So as Dr. Reed used the term overwork and overproduction, I will share that early in my career, that's all that I was focused on. And quite frankly, didn't see a need for boundaries, didn't have it role modeled for me, didn't understand why that might be an effective, healthy thing for me and others for that matter. And it was when I became a parent that I started under.
Kate, I accidentally hit the stop record button.
That's okay. She just
start over. Okay, can I read the question again and we'll go back to you right away?
Sure, okay, of course.
All right. Well, let's move on to our next area that we wanted to explore, and that is about boundaries. And boundaries have become even more important over the last year as the natural separations many of us had between work, family, parenting, socializing. Those natural separations pre-pandemic really became more porous. Kate, let's turn to you about the importance of setting boundaries and what are you doing as a leader to set them, and how would you say what makes it difficult? I'm curious to learn from you on this.
Thanks for the great question, Molly. First, I'll say I'm not an expert and am still very much so a learner in this space and continue to evolve as boundaries are necessary and can be really challenging. As Dr. Reed just used the word overworked and overproduction, and I will tell you that early in my career, I was very focused on high production and I'd say valued the number of hours that I was needed at work and derived a lot of pleasure from that. And that changed when I became a parent myself and quickly realized the old saying, right? You need to put on your oxygen mask first before you help others. It's often we're reminded of that when we hop on a flight. And I was running pretty low on oxygen, really living my life in this overworked, production sort of cycle, and started to, at that point, begin to set some boundaries about when the workday ends, when I need to be home to enjoy my family, things like self-care, how I was going to put time on my work calendar for when I was going to exercise. Even started to do things like I have a lunch date with my husband over the noon hour twice a month because the kids are in school and I can actually schedule a lunch date and I'm still awake at noon, which is a lot different than Friday night at 6 o'clock. And so those were just some, small but tangible ways that I started to structure that into my life, those boundaries. And then there became as my responsibilities grew, and particularly the last year, where I think, Molly, you said it best. You said, a lot of the last year and a half, everything has felt like an emergency. The key words there were they felt like an emergency, but not everything was an emergency, many things. And so I would find myself, 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night getting texts. And oftentimes it was something that really was someone who was up on call, who wanted to let me know something, but it could be discussed in the morning. And I would find myself getting trapped into text conversations at midnight. Well, just because you're in the hospital on call for this evening doesn't mean that I need to be up. And it was actually my husband who one night, I think after hearing my phone basically singing a song with text messages on our nightstand, said, "It really all can't be an emergency, Kate. If the hospital was on fire, they're going to call the fire department, not you," which is true. And so I remember that. I try to think about that today when someone is pinging me, calling me, etc. Of course, one of my jobs as a leader is to be available. The question is, how available is right? And how do you triage that so that you give people the appropriate time and attention they need, but not everything is an emergency. And if I kept responding whenever people would text me, then I was also training individuals that I was available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I'm not, and I can't be. I think another important boundary is when you take time off, actually take time off. People watch what we do as leaders. We are setting a powerful message, and that we're on a stage of what right looks like and what leadership looks like. And so if I'm to go on vacation, but be on my phone or sending emails or doing phone calls the whole time, the message I'm sending to folks is, you should really still work when you're on vacation. And so I've worked very hard to set that boundary. I am not available to the workplace when I'm on vacation, not at all. And that, I think, has also, and I encourage my team to do the same and highlight that they don't hear from me when I take time off. So I think that it's an important thing for us all to do, is to make sure that our words and actions match and that we're demonstrating those sort of boundaries. The other thing that we've done in the last year that we hadn't done before was really evaluate who needs to be on call and for how long. And so because I work across 4 hospitals, we previously had this idea that, every hospital had to have one person on call. Turns out, chief nursing officer can very capably respond to a nursing question across multiple campuses. And so as we were finding ourselves up basically, all hours of the day, all days of the week, we started to work closer together. There's been many conversations already today about how we're learning what each other's roles are during this time. And we did that even as a call team across our regional hospitals that I work with. And so we began to say, no, Kate, really, you need to go home and not interact with work for 3 days. I'm on call for your hospitals and I've got it. You can trust that I've got it. And I think that those sort of boundaries are not only good for us as individuals, but what they signal to our team is, I trust you. And I trust that you're going to do a great job, and it builds that kind of camaraderie. And then it also allows us as a team to learn more about each other and each other's work and really walk in each other's shoes. So that kind of boundary settings really, I think, helped us as a group develop more as a team as well. Last but not least, and I think it's an important thing, well, I could go on for a long time, but for this brief moment, I'll say that throughout my career, I have definitely received feedback from my husband of 21 years that sometimes he gets what's left of me. And those are really hard words to hear from someone that you love. And it's a reminder to me, it's actually a loving thing for him to say to me, to say, I need more of you. I want more of you. And it's always a reminder of me that I need to reevaluate where I am spending time and the times of the day that I'm spending it, so that the people that are really important in my life, like my husband and children, do get more of me and some of the best parts of me, and that I'm sharing that with them as well. And that really goes back to then me reevaluating, where are my boundaries? Have I been paying attention to them? Do I need to reevaluate? And that goes part of this just kind of constant learning and growing. But have people in your life partners, husbands, friends, etc., that can be that mirror when you are not doing a great job of boundary management, and you maybe need someone to reflect that back to you so you can be your best self.
Some great insights as to the how and to why this is important and why it matters and what effect it can have on teams. I think in addition to medicine and healthcare, media, and not Becker's, but media as a whole also has an interesting relationship with boundaries too, Kate. So I'm relating to a lot of what you're saying from another field. But I'm curious, you mentioned in your opening remarks a few of the positive reinforcements that can make boundaries and porous boundaries, why people can live with them for so long, feeling needed at work, feeling like you're solving problems. These are things that are rewarding. But can we talk, maybe we can hear about from some of your co-panelists about some of the reinforcers that, is it because asserting oneself can be offensive? I guess, what are some of the reasons that boundary setting and enforcing can be difficult?
Yeah, I can definitely give a couple of my thoughts. First of all, if I could incorporate half of the things that Kate mentioned, I'd be a very happy wife and mother. I think these are definitely challenges, especially with the younger kids and the work demands, but very insightful. I think, one of the bigger challenges that I face is all of my leaders, the direct leaders and mentors don't unplug. They are constantly at work much later than I am. And I start my mornings early because I want to be home for dinner, which is unusual for surgeon. And by dinner, I mean 6:30 because my kids are a little bit younger. But I think it is a difficult thing to set when everybody around you who is in the leadership position is working late, is still here. Now, I should mention that these are all men. And these are not the men of our generation who are beginning to take a bigger part in family and children, but these are a little bit of the older school men for who work comes first. So I think it is very important for us, again, that fear of that negative, perception as a female. But I am actively working on it, and it's great to hear from the other panelists how to continue the work on this.
I'd like to add to something that Kate said about when you have boundaries. You said example, our future women leaders, if we have more setting of these examples, that boundaries basically are sharing with those that are climbing the ladder, that we trust you. I'm going to set the boundary here because then you can actually carry the baton. I think that's incredibly important, that it's okay to have boundaries and not apologize for them, to have it be a method to serve others who want to be leaders of the future as it relates to, this particular topic that we're talking about today.
I could tag on to what my friends are saying here, and exclamation point on everything. I do think for people in general, there is time that we have to take for self-reflection. There is time that we have to carve out silence and say, am I happy? Am I fulfilled? What creates meaning for me? What are the things that go beyond this moment in time and will last forever? And, those things always have to do with love and family and, our relationships. Very rarely, is it that the job is going to hit the top of the list, but yet, I'm pretty sure that everyone who is here is extremely passionate and dedicated to what they do and have deep, heartfelt feelings about why they're doing what they do, and I'm the same way. But I do think that we find and we learn over time, and hopefully younger people, well, it seems like the generations who are younger are a little bit more balanced, but I think you do get caught up when you work with male colleagues or you work with people in general who are driven. There is a peer pressure to be the same way, even if you're dying inside, right? And so just speaking from personal experience, and I kind of want to tie this question with the last question, I had to stop and ask myself that question. I was doing 15 million things, at the same time, and I really wasn't happy. And I was exhausted, and I had taken myself beyond a healthy point of exhaustion. So we have, acceptable things that we do to keep us alert. We drink coffee or we drink caffeine and we drink a lot of it. And then, oh my gosh, I can't turn my brain off. I need to take something to help me to go to sleep, and that can be a range of things, whether it's a glass of wine or an Ambien. Yes, I said that. We do these things and then we find ourselves functioning, on these chemicals to just help us live. And my husband had a conversation with me and I realized how tired I was. And I decided that I actually needed to take a sabbatical, that I needed more than just a week or two. I wanted 3 months. I knew my body needed 3 months. And I went to my boss, a male, and I stated that. And I actually brought evidence as to why sabbaticals were good, and that companies do these things and why they do these things, and to make a long story short, I probably was the first senior executive in my company's history that even suggested such a thing. It was very, very difficult. And this is just the reality of it. It was very difficult for males primarily to accept that something was not wrong with me. That it could just be fatigue, right? And that I just wanted to be healthy so that I could keep going, and doing what I wanted to do. But they supported me in it. So, and this kind of sneaks into the empowerment thing, but they supported it. And 3 months goes by in a blink. It takes the first month for you to just realize, okay, I can stop sleeping now and maybe go do something because I'm so tired. But it did come at a price. It did come at a price. And even though my career went on to be extremely successful in the organization, there was always this question, well, is Monica okay? Well, how do we know she can do that? But get this, at the same time, men coming up to me, I can't believe you had the courage to do that. I'm so exhausted. I wish that I could do it. Colleagues, men and females in the ED with panic attacks. These are administrators, developing twitches and the stories I could tell you about how we abuse ourselves and the personal conversations, the on the side conversations of, oh my God, Monica, I wish I could do the same thing. But then the meeting conversation of be strong, be a man, all of you, women and men, and what that means. And the question of, oh, there's a job opportunity. Well, does Monica now want to run this 800-bed hospital? She got tired once, and I have enough self-confidence and maybe even arrogance, if you will, in a good way, or I'm a tempered radical, if you will, to say, get out of here with that. You're tired too. You're just not willing to admit it. There's a courage that it takes. But at the same time, even if you don't want to give me the job, I'm not going to lose my life over this mirage of Superwoman. That's just not going to happen. And I think sometimes we do have to make those tough choices, but times are changing that are allowing us as women to speak truth to power in ways that when I did this, because I am a little bit of an old lady, but 20 years ago, but even now, people just don't step out, but you have to determine what is important for you long term. And I think that people who are A players, and I know every woman on this call is, they'll get what they need. They'll get the satisfaction, they'll get the job, and they can have it, but it does sometimes come at a sacrifice.
Well, I appreciate that story so much. I'm sure the co-panelists do too, because as you illustrated, it takes courage to ask for that and to say you need a break, but at the same time, you're realistically saying be ready, because it also comes with a double bind, which is people might see you as more fragile than they did before you made that request. Yeah. Well, I want to go.
Oh, sorry, Molly. I was just going to jump in and say, as you were talking, Dr. Reed, I was just thinking about how, thank you for doing that for you and for others. That was a really courageous move and a really big leadership move for you and for others. So thank you for doing that, for sharing that. I think it's also a great example of you set a boundary. I need to go take care of myself. And there were consequences, as you highlighted, for that. It made me think about, there was a point in my career where sometimes people think they make decisions for you. So I was not invited to a whole series of evening meetings, and I learned about it and sort of wondered why I hadn't been invited to participate in this series of evening meetings, all of which related directly to my work. And so I directly inquired, and did someone mistakenly leave me off the meeting, invite or whatever? And the response I got was, no, we understand that you have boundaries because of your domestic pursuits. And so we didn't think you'd want to come. And my response was, thank you for thinking of me, but next time, please give me the opportunity to decide where my boundaries are and how I use my time versus you making that decision on my behalf. That's just another small example of how my really appropriate, healthy boundaries were sort of put back in my face. And I think that's what we just need to say, no, thank you.
Right.
I can make this decision. You don't need to do that for me.
Love that. Love that.
So many ways boundaries can be helpful, but also I think we just got a sampler's portion of how they can go awry and be mishandled. So appreciate the comments on this. For the sake of time, Mary Beth, I'm going to move on and turn to you for our next question, which is about the distinction between mentorship, sponsorship, and coaching. You hear these phrases a lot. Sometimes it's easy for them to run together as acts of benevolence and constructive ways women can be advanced and take shape and evolve throughout their careers. What do you need from each of these buckets, and how would you initiate that conversation if you are looking for a mentor, a sponsor, a coach?
Okay, well, since my friends on the panel have shared some of their personal stories, I thought it would be helpful to just kind of walk through my career path and how each of these things kind of took place over the several decade-long career that I'm currently in. So I am actually a nurse by training. I went to Rush University in Chicago and found myself working at a large system as a registered nurse, and had a clinical nurse specialist at the time who took a special interest in my desire to be a leader. I wanted to kind of join the healthcare field because I like to take care of patients, but as I spoke about earlier, kind of a control freak, like to make decisions, and I thought, I want to marry my clinical practice with the ability to help shape decisions in a hospital or healthcare organization. And at that time, the clinical nurse specialist was working with a female CEO of another hospital to develop an open heart surgery program. And she saw that I was someone who, desired an opportunity to move up the chain, and she sponsored my being made an employee there to help make that happen. She put me in my first management role and said, I'm going to give you the resources and open up doors for you. I'm going to invest in your future, if you will. And that's pretty much kind of what a sponsor does. When you think about sponsorship in the truest sense of the word, and what we all kind of think about is people who invest money to make something happen. Well, she invested in me. She didn't invest money, she invested her time. Throughout the course of my time at that organization, she helped coach me as she was getting coaches. Again, I feel so fortunate to have worked at pretty much every organization I've been in. I've worked with a female leadership team. So I think I've had some of the benefits that maybe some of my panelists and maybe some of you listening today might not have, and that is working with females and being groomed and cultivated by females who kind of understand the female perspective. And throughout my time there, I learned a lot from this particular individual as she coached me in my job. She helped instruct me on how to do certain things. She ultimately became my mentor because mentorship is really a deep relationship between two people. Usually someone with a lot more experience who can say, hey, let me show you the ropes, but I'm going to teach you, I'm going to sponsor you, but I'm also going to open up doors, teach you about relationships, kind of be your cheerleader. And that particular individual, who is no longer my mentor, I have had other mentors since, really kind of helped shape the leader that I am today, in large part because she invested her experience in me, not only as a leader, but as a woman who was also raising a family and in this business of healthcare, where we give of ourselves to others who aren't even in our family, where we share ourselves that way. I had a turning point at that organization that was kind of a point of reflection for me. That was 20 years ago, and you can just imagine it was 20 years ago this month, where after 9/11, I chose to take a little time off myself and kind of reflect on what I wanted to do next and to be kind of picky about where I was going to go. Fortunately for me, someone who I had worked with in my past at this other organization had an opportunity here where I currently am. My name kind of came up, and he sponsored me and basically said, this is an individual that I worked with in the past. She's got a lot of promise as a leader. I think she would be a great addition to our team. And they reached out to me, asked if I would be interested. And, 18 years later, I'm in this organization, really, again, growing and learning and being coached and mentored by others, including a female CEO who is absolutely fantastic. She spends a lot of time with very firm boundaries herself, firm boundaries for her executive team, in the way that we talked about after Kate's explanation of boundaries, how having boundaries for ourselves helps others to be trusted to grow themselves. So as a female leader, I am also a mother of 2 grown children. I'm a grandmother of a little boy. I have a much different perspective several decades into my career than I did many, many years ago. But I do remember a lot of what I've learned from those female leaders along the way, and a couple of guys too that have been wonderful to me and kind of taught me the ropes, that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to learn from others, to say that I don't know, to say, hey, show me the way. And I try to impart that on those that report to me, most of whom are women. I mean, let's face it, the healthcare field, aside maybe from the physician side, is predominantly, female caregivers. And I try very hard to impart the same type of mentorship, in that I understand where you are in your life, because I have some young mothers who work for me. Working from home is an option for them. I allow them to do that because I understand it's important to, spend time with your family, and you can balance work and family if given the right resources to do so. So in that way, again, getting back to the definitions, I have sponsored them and said, I will invest in you. I will invest in resources to be able to give to you so that you can do this type of work at home. So, kind of in a nutshell, I would say that, in the strictest sense of the term, a coach is someone who instructs you how to do things. A sponsor is someone who invests, whether it be time or money or energy in you. But a mentor kind of does all of those things. They coach, they instruct, they counsel, they provide advice. They're a trusted confidant, someone that can help you grow in many different areas, because it's not just in the professional workplace that we have mentors. We can have mentors in other areas of interest that we have in our lives. I've just been very fortunate, being that we're talking about women leaders, that I've been able to be mentored by some very strong, successful, incredibly intelligent women who understand what it means to be a woman in the workplace and don't apologize for it, and basically kind of say, you can be whatever you want to be, and let me help you through that.
Some really powerful relationships you shared, Mary Beth. And I'm curious, I think sometimes people can assume mentorship, it comes down to taking someone out for coffee, sitting them down, almost having them agree to be a mentor in this really a formal and structured, organized way. But I also think there's all these ways you can be informal mentors to one another. Did these relationships, did you initiate them by asking for consent and having almost an organized meetings with them, or was it much more just watching them, seeing what they do, how they react, picking up cues from them?
You know what, for me personally, it was never a formal ask. It was a development of a relationship. And, for the person to continue to be able to be there for me, to provide advice, was always, hey, do you mind if I ask you how you would deal with a situation, or I'm in a, I have a situation that I'm looking for, your experience in. I think those that become mentors and are there, it's just a natural thing. It comes about naturally. Maybe in corporate America, it might be more of a formal relationship. But I think in healthcare, we're people. You know, we form relationships because our business is about people. Our business is to be compassionate and kind and giving. And I've had those that have been my mentors. When I've said to them, you know, you are a mentor to me, they're kind of, well, isn't that wonderful? Not like, well, you never asked me if I could do that. It's just been a natural evolution of our relationship, I would say.
Let's check in with your co-panelists and see if there's anything they would add to the great distinction you provided. Mentorship is kind of expands the gamut of relationships, coaching, trust, sponsorship, whereas sponsorship and coaching is a bit more distinct. Dr. Reed, Dr. Damani, Kate, anything you would add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd definitely like to say I'm envious of Mary Beth's being surrounded by strong female leaders. That's definitely something that we don't have enough of here. I mean, I finished my training about 20 years ago, and at that time, you know, the senior female surgeons that I interacted with were unfortunately not those kinds of mentors, at least the ones I came across. I think they really had what we call survivorship bias, where, you know, I got through this through personal resolve, and I beat the odds in a male-dominated field. And you know what? You got to do the same. It's all about that resolve, and there are no barriers based on gender. And that kind of legitimizes this kind of, you know, lack of mentorship that is needed and sponsorship that is needed. So my mentors have been mostly males who do not have really, despite their, you know, understanding and being married and children, they cannot have the same kinds of insights that sometimes we need. So I think it's really wonderful. I certainly hope, I think now through Association of Women Surgeons and Women in Medicine, hopefully we can provide that for our future generations more.
Yeah, I think I might add to this, you know, the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. I think it takes a village to raise any of us. And so I appreciate this distinction about coaching, mentorship, and sponsorship. And I think that as I sort of would reflect back on my life to date, I always kind of had a village of people. And there wasn't one person that served or could, you know, live my life or understand or walk in my shoes. But there were many people that could contribute to different questions or parts of that that I've benefited from the diversity of those perspectives and experiences, and then been able to draw from that as it relates to my own life. And I've really enjoyed that. I think grown a lot by being able to work with and learn from so many leaders, and certainly try to do the same for others. I think maybe an opportunity for all of us. I keep thinking back to this sort of unique time that we're in, when folks may not be as visible in our organizations, or are in living out their work in remote or more flexible ways. So this idea of relationship, but how we reach out to folks that are maybe less visible, so that we do continue to sponsor or serve as a member of different people's villages, so we can help folks, you know, continue to learn and grow even in these unique circumstances. So I think it does take all of us being intentional about who are those folks that we can help or contribute with, and just be really intentional about reaching out to them.
Well, Mary Beth, thank you so much for that tremendous overview. Very helpful to think about those roles that way, and how we really need all of them, especially now more than ever, I would say. Dr. Reed, let's turn to you for our final question, and then we're going to conclude by hearing from the panelists all together. But one key group that they've been mentioned a few times here, but not talked about at length, is men. What role can men play in empowering women and being really powerful allies for women?
I really appreciate the question. And I think in some ways, we've probably played around the edges of it throughout the conversation. We can't have a conversation about where women need to be and want to be in the workplace without mentioning men. Men who have helped, men who have challenged us, men who have been role models. You know, as I was reflecting on my own career, I realized, with the exception of literally the job that I just took this year in a consulting relationship, all of my promotions have come by way of men. All of my major teaching and residency, men. And so I think when we look at this on an individual level, and so there's the individual and then there's the organizational, you know, environment that I think we have to consider. You know, men, as we discussed in the beginning, are the people who are in power and who have the characteristics that have been deemed appropriate based on their gender and personality in terms of what appropriate behavior looks like in the workplace and how one is to work in the workplace. And even though we've made, I think, tremendous strides through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, you know, if you look at the studies, things have kind of fallen back a bit, you know, for women. And certainly, I would say, even still, with all of the strides that you've seen, if you look in upper leadership, if you look at boards, if you look at general surgery and surgical specialties, the vast majority are men. I mean, we're talking a ratio of 80 to 20%. And so if that's going to change, there is no way that men cannot be involved because they're the majority of the people who are sitting there, if you will, right? And so part of that really comes down to us men, us helping men realize these gaps that we're talking about. Some will be inclined to see it. Most are not, quite honestly. It's just not something that's thought about. So if you look at the research, most men believe that women have equal opportunity in the workplace. They still believe that. They don't believe that we're challenged in any way. They believe that their employers are creating those equal opportunities. And so it's very difficult when you're starting from a mindset that is really, in the truest sense of the word, ignorant of the challenges that women face, for them to now be an empowerment partner, or what I'd rather say, an ally. How do you become an ally for me? How do you advocate for me in situations and circumstances where my voice may not be heard, or where someone is mansplaining what it is I have to say, even though I may know more about the topic than they do? How do you bring people to that point? And again, it comes back to a certain amount of courage that I think we as women have to have, and tapping into our intuitive natures and emotional intelligence to look for those places, those cracks where there can be a courageous conversation had, or where there's an opening, and there is societal pressure, right? With Me Too, with, you know, let's say 45% of women being displaced during COVID, to say, what are we going to do now? So I would say that the time is ripe for the more difficult conversation, the uncomfortable conversation, discussing the undiscussable, if you will. There's a societal milieu, I believe, that exists now that allows that conversation to happen. And one of the ways I think that it can be approached, that perhaps is not so emotionally charged, at least as we kind of lay this foundation brick by brick, is from a business perspective itself. Proven over and over again that diverse environments that include women, people of color, businesses perform better. There's more job satisfaction. There's more, the bottom line is healthier. I mean, to the tune of 25 to 36% more. You know, that's a language, if you will, I think that businesses can get behind, at least to open the door. What we also know, though, is that even as we form these employee resource groups that are largely women dominated to empower ourselves, that those groups don't do nearly as well as they do when men are involved. Why? Because men are actually the ones who are the majority of holding those cards, right? And it's a place of learning for them. So if we invite men into the audience, not just as a sponsor, if you will, although the sponsorship is nice, I would push it a little further to say, how do we help male leaders become accountable in terms of the gender parity that is needed, be it in business, in the OR. When I was chief medical officer, I would say medical staff governance is overwhelmingly male dominated with very strong unconscious biases about the role of men and women. And so where I had to look for those gaps where I could help to educate men who are open and looking for it. But I do think we're at a place in time where we can capitalize on the societal pressure that is being placed on the gaps that exist for those who are not rightly represented in the workforce, and have men not only, so if you're apathetic, meaning you don't have knowledge and you don't want knowledge, how do you move now to a point of acceptance? Something's going on here that I don't know about. Let me at least learn. For those who are accepting, how do I move them to activity? How do I get them to a place where if they hear someone mansplaining, or if they hear, analogies that are used in the office setting that are sports related, or something that automatically excludes women, that they may have the courage to step up? And then how do I take that person who is active and now move them to advocate? So I think there's some individual work that has to be done there, but I think organizations have to begin to commit. And again, most of these organizations, male dominated, have to begin to commit to processes that are making those changes. So I can say as an individual, well, I understand, Kate, I understand Dr. Damani, I understand Mary Beth, what you're going through. And, I'm right there behind you. And that may help one of us grow, which is great, but it doesn't help the overall problem, and that's how we reach gender parity, how every voice is being heard. And so it really does get to the point where we have to begin addressing processes, where we have to set charters in meetings that says that people will be quiet until everyone is done talking, so that people aren't jumping in when a woman has something to say, or jumping in when I'm talking about a patient because you think you know more. That you will look at the diversity on your team and you will say, how do we bring more people in that represent different opinions that make us better? We have to start laying those types of foundations, and men can do this brick by brick. And it is slow, difficult, messy work. But where we find one who can partner with us and take them along on that journey, I think is very important. And fortunately, I think that the time is ripe where we can take advantage of some of those things.
Dr. Ray, I have a follow-up question for you, which is some attendees, and even I, as you were speaking, sometimes I hear the term empowering men, and then I also think of, like being responsible for them. And I know part of this work is that it is not the oppressed person's job to get the other individual completely up to speed on all of their challenges and their history.
Right.
You aren't responsible for educating them. Can you distinguish empowering from like hand holding? And I think, because that's a whole other type of labor.
It is, right?
Yeah.
It is. And I think that the line is fuzzy, quite honestly. I would be lying if I didn't say that line was fuzzy. I could take the attitude, and in some ways I'm kind of in this intersectionality place, right? So I'm a female, I'm a person of color, and so yes, there are times when as a female, I don't want to have to explain to you why what you said is inappropriate, you know? But there's a disadvantage to me not showing up in that way, you know, to help you expand your lens, the lens through which you're looking. And if I can do that in a group, if I can do that with organizations where we're having men be a part of it, the easier that is. I think when we get to the point where what we're saying feels more burdensome, and I feel demoralized by the process that I'm in, then I've gone from a place of my own self-empowerment, if you will, my own self-agency, to a place now where I'm hand-holding a reluctant partner into a process that is not going to benefit either one of us. And so I think, again, it comes back to a tremendous amount of attunement that we as women have to choose to take on. You know, some will choose it, some won't. But I think for this group, when we're talking about how we move together, we have to take advantage of those moments in time to educate and or to offer a book, you know, or to offer a show or a program or a podcast. And then to go hey, and maybe the next time when we run into each other, you can tell me how you like that, you know, kind of creating that subtle accountability. I'm going to ask you about that again, you know. But I think it is slow, messy work. I think we have to accept that. But we know we're not where we used to be. But I think we have to be very, very careful that we don't lose momentum. And I think the pandemic has wreaked a little bit of havoc on the momentum that we've had as women in the workplace in terms of, again, the myths that we have about who's supposed to be doing what. And I think it's incumbent upon men as accountable leaders, actually, as an accountable leader, not just as a male, but as an accountable leader, an accountable chairman, to broaden the vision and say, I'm missing out by not having more people at the table.
Let me open up to see if there's any other reactions from your co-panelists before we move on to our final question.
Dr. Reed, when you referenced a podcast just a minute ago, it made me want to share, if any of you are familiar with Brene Brown and her podcasts, there's in one of her podcasts, she talks about, there's a lot of assumptions in communication, women to women, men to men, men to women, everyone's communication. And we sometimes fill in the blanks, even though we don't really know what the other is thinking. And in one of her podcasts, she suggests that if we work on catching ourselves in that moment when we're finishing or assuming something about the other, and if we instead verbalize something like, Dr. Reed, when you say things or do things like that, the story I tell myself is, and then you explain how you've finished it. And I've used that in relationships, and that enables you to say, wow, Kate, I didn't know that. Actually, what I meant was, and it just helps us sort of in a maybe more comfortable way, say, here's what I was thinking when you did that. Is that what you meant? And I've begun to use that in my interactions, and it's been really amazing how many relatively comfortable conversations that started where we were just not understanding how our communication or intent was misunderstood. Yeah. So just share that as a small tool that I've begun to use that seems to work well.
That's beautiful. You know, it reminds me of a conversation that I had, and I'm sure my women colleagues have had this, when you're standing with a bunch of men, we're having a strategy session, say we have to go meet with a partner, and it's like, you know, we don't have any women in our group. We need a woman to be there, you know, so you're not inviting me because you think I have something strategic to offer. You're inviting me because I'm a woman. And you know, my natural reaction is to take great offense at that and say, you know, well, perhaps I can lend you a few body parts and you can handle that yourself. But what we know is that, Kate, that's not really gonna win this partner, right? But that's, you know, so I think there is a natural reaction that we have, like, whoa, did you actually just like say that? But if I took the approach of, you know, when you said this is how I understood it. Is that what you meant? And, let's just assume that I did some variation of that. And certainly I didn't say, let me lend you some body parts. That would have been a career limiting move. But the person said to me, well, I didn't realize that I had phrased it that way. So it wasn't even as if the moment was shocking, because he wasn't trying to excuse his actions. He said, I didn't even realize that that was the way I phrased it. Yes, Monica, we want you there, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it didn't take away from kind of what else was motivating the desire for my presence, but it opened an understanding and a conversation that, had I come the way I felt with my full self, that opportunity would not have been there. I love that.
Well, we're going to move on to our final question. This was chock full of so many insights and such a dynamic conversation. I wanted to close by asking each of you to offer a piece of advice for the next generation of women leaders. And this question we're going to end on is intentionally broad, so I encourage you to tailor your advice to the topic perhaps you spoke to in greater detail earlier, or any other insights that you feel are really important for our attendees to walk away with today. Dr. Damani, I'll turn to you first.
Thank you, Molly. Yeah, no, I think it is a broad topic. I mean, just to kind of keep it brief, I'm so glad you joined us today. I definitely gained some insights. My advice would be really kind of a three-pronged thing. Follow your own path. Don't try to recreate someone else's, because that led them to success. My trajectory was different. I decelerated early in my career. I was in community practice, raised a family, and then came back to academics, and then ramped up my both clinical and academic career. So just be yourself and follow your own path. The other thing, know your value and know how to articulate your value, because I think it is just so important. As we talked about, women can sometimes end up, due to these biases, end up devaluing themselves, and push yourself for those stretch jobs and negotiate and articulate your value. And then in the process, finally lift and empower other women. I think, as Dr. Reed said, the pandemic has set us even farther behind. The gender, pay gap is 30 years back now because of the pandemic than where we were. So I think, time is important and our contributions are important. So lift and empower other women through this process.
Be yourself, know your value, lift and empower other women. Mary Beth, what would you add to this running tally?
Okay, so I would say show up. Don't be afraid and don't apologize. But as you seek to be understood, understand others. As we just spoke about earlier, is other people might not know the way they're coming across unless you bring it up. So if you want to be understood, try to open yourselves up to others' experiences, their upbringing, the biases in the household that they grew up with, and teach them. Teach them that women have value, understand your value, but show up and make it happen.
Show up even for those difficult conversations. Dr. Reed, how about you? Your best advice for our attendees today?
Well, I'm trying to think of a new one right now, because some of mine have already been taken. But I think I would say, remember that this is not an us versus them. That we are individual and group, and some of your best advice comes from people who happen to be male, or a person who happens to be female. I've got wonderful career advice and mentoring from men who to this day are very close friends, mentors, and I would not be in the place that I'm in right now had it not been from some of those male partners. So remember that we're talking about individuals that we can develop relationships with as we discuss the group problem, and try to navigate both.
And Kate, you are last in what is not always an easy position after so much valuable advice has already been offered up, but what would you add to your co-panelist remarks?
I'd say grow your village. Make sure that you have a diverse set of people that you can connect with as part of your own learning and growing process, and then be gentle with yourself. right? We've got a world full of critics, and we're often our worst critics. So be gentle, because we are all constantly learning and growing and evolving. And so give yourself permission to do that.
Wonderful. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Before we close out, though, I'm going to turn it over to Darla once more for a few closing remarks.
Wow, Molly, I mean, I got to tell you, I could talk to these women leaders for hours. I'm sure you feel the same. There are so many personal takeaways from what we heard today for myself, as well as, I represent our intuitive employees. Setting boundaries, dealing with change, the importance of self-care, owning our journey of development, and leaning into others to help us get there, overcoming unconscious bias, being curious, and finding networks with a shared purpose that can help support us all. My hope is that this information today can serve as a galvanizing force for change. And for the next generations of leaders out there, you have my commitment that we will continue to raise awareness on the impact of gender bias and inequality, that we will continue to work on increasing representation of female leaders at all levels, because if you can see it, you can be it. And that we will also work on ensuring that we build peer communities of support, that we have networks, that we have mentors, sponsors, and allies all available, because these we know are the most critical elements of success. So thank you to all of our panelists, and to Molly, our moderator from Becker's. I really look forward to continuing this discussion that we started today, and to possibly doing another event like this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Darla. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists, Mary Beth, Dr. Reed, Kate, and Dr. Damani for a wonderful conversation today. And also I want to thank Intuitive for sponsoring today's webinar. To learn more about the content that was presented today, please check out the resources section on your webinar console and fill out that post-webinar survey. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.